Welcome. You're listening to the Good Girls Don't podcast with Ashley Ray
and Verity Mansfield.
This is the podcast where we smash those rules that we've been taught to follow both as men and women and burn the damn rule book. We're tackling the big issues and the issues nobody wants to talk about, and we'll be fiercely feminist about it.
This podcast is about inspiration, education, compassion, and being the change that you need to see in this world. This podcast is for the trailblazers, the freedom fighters, and the soul igniters, and all the women just like you who are ready to break the good girl rules and be heard.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and its First Nations people on which this podcast is produced and consumed. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Get ready for the revolution. It's coming to you now. It's coming to you now. We're gonna sing it, revolution. And they'll never bring us down. No, they'll never bring us down.
Verity, do you know that non-binary people exist?
I do, funnily enough.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. It's a gorgeous episode, I feel, because, and such an important topic, as my sibling does identify as being a non-binary person.
Okay, so this is a really important episode, and before we really dive into what it's all about, I want to give you some background and a bit of context for this interview. We live in a society that dictates a very strict definition of what masculinity is, and it demands really rigid expectations on how men and women need to conform to binary gender roles. So these are things like macho man, and things like women belong in the kitchen or popping out babies, like those kinds of gender roles. The struggle to inform others that non-binary people actually exist is a very real thing. So we spoke to Nic Lawrance, and Nic really took the time to chat with us about their incredible experience of living as a non-binary person, growing up with the language to express their identity, and journey of acceptance from family and peers, finding that safe space to explore and express gender identity, and some of the present perils fraught in the legal system that discriminates against gender diverse people and the dangers therein.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful interview, and I have so much love for Nic. Nic is my sibling, and we really thought that Nic would be the perfect person to have this conversation with, because Nic has enabled my children and even my partner to understand these concepts, and Nic does it in such a beautiful way that I thought was so important, that I really, really wanted to share with people. And, you know, Nic is a brilliant and powerful non-binary burlesque performer in Perth, WA. He has performed at Fringe Festival and throughout Perth for quite a while. And Nic has these incredible ways of blending ideas and concepts of the feminine and the masculine together, of challenging the norms of what is traditionally acceptable or even expected of a masc presenting human. I love Nic for this, going out for dinner with Nic, and Nic will turn up in a three-piece suit and with earrings and makeup, and it's just so empowering and actually really beautiful, and the creativity involved. Nic's performances are incredible. They are actually, I am a massive love of burlesque. And yet, whenever I see a show that Nic is in, my mind is absolutely blown. And it is absolutely such an incredible performance, and the power and the messaging that Nic puts in those are just, they're mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. So we just discussed, so many issues that come up with this with Nic, and even being able to normalize the idea of asking for pronouns, asking for someone's pronouns as easily as you do ask for someone's name.
Yeah, or their title.
Yeah, reclaiming the word queer, because it's been used so in such derogatory senses, and how the queer community have actually embraced the word and made it their own, and I think that is incredible and powerful.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that something that was really, really big for me that happened with this conversation was we talked a lot about medical gatekeeping that happens from people never being able to be properly recognized legally and medically how they want to be recognized. That was a huge part of this discussion. And, I'm not going to lie, it got a little bit grim, but it was incredibly enlightening as well. And we also talked a lot about what happens when men don't fit into the, in air quotes, man's club. What happens if you aren't the macho dude with the six pack and, you're not a super hyper masculine dude?
Yeah, who's into cars, or
Sport.
is hairy, or into beer and stuff. And we so often, like with feminism, we're so aware that there's women who are like, hey, do you know what if I don't want to cook cake today? You know what I mean? And they challenge the notions of being in the kitchen and being able to be at work. And what if I don't want to have children just because I have ovaries? And we're getting those conversations out there, but we really aren't having enough conversations about the stereotypes and the demands for men to fit into a certain subcategory in such a rigid form. So I think as feminists and intersectional feminists, this conversation is so necessary to have, to support anyone as they express their feminine or masculine sides.
Yes, and we also spoke a lot about the dangers of identifying yourself as a non-binary person to different organizations and institutions. This is as simple as filling out an intake form if you go to a new GP.
Yeah, and even being able to do things like changing your driver's license, if you do, change your physical, I don't know what the correct words would be, but, for transgender people, there's so many issues wrapped up in it. We, as hetero, sexual, yeah, we just don't face these issues, and we don't know that they're there, and then we don't have the sympathy or the empathy for other humans that are dealing with things that we don't even have to bother thinking about.
Yes, and look, another point that came up in this conversation that was really incredible when we really were thinking about the questions that we'd like to ask Nic and the things that we wanted to explore together was, what's the difference, if any, between sexuality and gender?
Yeah, and just because we identify as being a certain gender doesn't mean that there's a fixed sexuality that goes with that. That was actually really incredibly important. And we also talked about why all humans, even men, should be able to have the right to feel pretty.
Yes, I love this so much because I'm just going to throw this in, because I often petition my partner, Scotty, and say, like, do you want to go and do something really nice for yourself? Like, do you want to go get a manicure or a pedicure or a massage or something, like something that makes you feel really good? And he's still figuring out his feelings around these things. But it just reminds me, like, when we have boys that are young, they don't give a toss about whether they're wearing nail polish or not unless we tell them that it's wrong.
Yeah, it's so true.
It's really fascinating to think about.
Yeah, so there's so many issues and topics we discussed, the legal implications and limits of identifying as non-binary gender, and also why intersectional feminism is crucial to the freedom of all minority groups.
It's a really beautiful conversation. We really applaud Nic for joining us and for being so vulnerable and open and willing to share what they did. It was really quite a moving conversation, at least for me. And it's just, it's incredible to think that all of this is going on inside someone that we just might not realize, that someone is facing all of these different barriers to do something as simple as, go to a new GP or put your car in for service and you have to fill out the detail forms. And it's like, how do you do that? I was just thinking after this conversation how many forms I fill out all the time and how angry I get when people misspell my name. And I can't imagine what that is like to do that at such a basic, like, you know, it's just incredible.
But even as well, like there's so many forms I fill out and it asks me if I'm male or female. And some of these forms that I filled out, I'm like, why do you even need to know? What does it possibly do for you? It's just a really fascinating conversation, and you're going to love Nic's vulnerability, their wisdom, their generosity, and especially how Nic shares with us, what to do if you get it wrong. What happens when you do say he or she, and how to just move through that in a really beautiful way. It's a fantastic conversation. You're absolutely going to love it, and you're absolutely going to love Nic.
Stay tuned, because this is coming up in just a second on Good Girls Don't Podcast.
Nic, we're so happy and excited to have you here, because I think talking about non-binary genderism, I don't know if that's a term itself, but I think it's such an important concept, and it's something that a lot of people feel really, really uncomfortable about, especially if they haven't been exposed to it, or if they don't know anyone who identifies in that way. It can be such a difficult conversation to navigate and to understand, because we have grown up in a very patriarchal, traditional society that really has dictated, like we talk about patriarchy so much and what is dictated for women, but it really has created a society where the definition of being masculine or being male has become very, very constricted and controlled. So we're so happy to have you here, and just so thankful to be able to have you to share with us your experience and your wisdom.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining me. And look, while we're here at introductions, I would just like to check in with both of you. Verity, what are your preferred pronouns, or what are your pronouns?
My pronouns are, like, I identify as a cisgender female. So my pronouns are she, her, not so much
perfect.
bitch face. But I have to say, what's really interesting is that while that just might seem very, very normal, I actually don't identify with terms like mate and buddy. And I actually get really pissed off when people refer to me as mate and buddy. I find them very, very, very masculine. It gets me really, really angry.
Yeah, would definitely love to come back to mate and buddy. But Ashley, what are your pronouns?
Well, interestingly, you asked me this at the beginning, and I was stumped because no one has ever actually asked me that question ever before. So I questioned myself for a moment. She and her, but I have a similar thing with Verity, but it's not around mate and buddy. For me, it's when people use really intimate terms like sweetheart or something like that, and they're a total stranger. That's where I get really ticked off. But other than that, I'm totally fine to be called she, her, by my name. Just don't call me a swear word and we're good.
Yeah, I would like to try and make a distinction here between terms of endearment or terms of familiarity, like mate and buddy, and love and dear and sweetheart, and pronouns, which would be she and her, he and him. I go by they and them pronouns, so I don't consider myself a she or her or a he and a him. There are such things as neo-pronouns, which are words that don't really yet exist. So MX is a very popular neo-pronoun, pronounced mix. Some people even go with mixter, so MX, STIER. Yeah, Mr., Miss, they're all part of pronouns. But yeah, in terms of endearment and familiarity, can also often be very gendered, and it's important to be able to recognize that. Like, I don't get a lot of people calling me sweetheart personally, or love, or dear. I'm not too sure how comfortable I would be, but that's probably a term of familiarity. And words like mate and buddy, I also don't particularly like being called mate or buddy, as they're very rooted in masculine culture, which is a culture that I do feel somewhat not denied, but disassociated with in life in general. And I think it's very easy for other masculine people, men, to use mate and buddy as it's a way of trying to include other people in your little mates club, or try and show people that you're friendly towards them. But it's a whole conversation about how people should also be quite happy to just say, hey, please don't call me mate. It's not that I'm not your friend, but it's a term of endearment that I don't associate with. It's a bit too personal. And this is all about how complicated humans are and how easy it is to have people get angry about really small things that at the end of the day don't matter.
Wow. So do you think that we need to be asking people whenever we meet them what their pronouns are? Is that something we should be doing?
Yes, is my short answer. The reason is it normalizes asking people for their pronouns. So I rarely get asked my pronouns. The only people who do ask me about my pronouns are queer people. Queer people being those who identify under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. A lot of young queer people, or a lot of young LGBTIQA plus people identify as queer as a shortening of the whole acronym in solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
I have had some interesting conversations with people who are older than me and older people in the LGBTQIA plus community who don't identify as queer, because that was used as a slur.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, how it's changed.
Yeah, my own mother really struggles with me using the word queer around her, because she's like, no, that was a slur back in my day. And it's a reclamation word. Young queer people have reclaimed the word queer because it is no longer a word about, ooh, you're different and weird. It is I'm different, and there's so many other different people around with me who exist in my community.
And I think it's a really beautiful way to look at it, isn't it? Like being able to say, hey, yeah, I'm different, but you know what? We kind of are all different. Like we all have different, quirks. We all identify with different things. We all have our own little, habits and way of dealing with the world, and how we show up and how we interpret things. And we're also, we've come from a society where we're so afraid to be different, and yet we yearn to be something special. And really, when you look at that in terms of being a word that's been reclaimed, it's actually a really beautiful way of just saying, yeah, I am different, but that's kind of, it should also just be seen as normal now to be different. Like,
yeah, it's still
not
a
something
homage.
to be judged or, ridiculed or bullied over, or
Yeah, it's still a tribute to queer history as well, though. Like, we acknowledge that queer people have been oppressed for practically
Millennia.
forever, as long as we can remember. And a really common thing that people say is, the Greeks and the Romans were fairly, wouldn't call them queer, but at least like gay and tolerant of homosexuality, when they weren't actually very tolerant of homosexuality. It was deeply rooted in patriarchal views, where whoever was receiving sex was considered the lesser of the two men. So yeah, look, even since those times, we've been oppressed.
Wow.
It's really quite fascinating, isn't it, when you do look at the history and you take into account and kind of honour that history, because so often, I think, especially if we're born as a cisgender or we identify as being cisgender, we really don't experience what the other feels, or we don't really have ways of being able to understand or have that empathy. And I really mean that deep empathy for what other people often go through. And I always feel very, very blessed. For those that don't know, Nic is my sibling, and I have learned so incredibly much from this human being, as has my children. And my children are growing up with these conversations as being normal. And I love that, because they certainly weren't normal conversations when I was growing up. And I'm pretty sure they weren't normal conversations when Nic was growing up.
They weren't normal conversations, and I'm extremely grateful that I do get the opportunity to have these conversations with young people, especially young people as young as your daughters are. They're not old by any stretch of the imagination yet, and yet they absorb it so well. They're just like, oh, yep, okay, that is how the world works, and they move on. They don't really have poor, what's the word I'm looking for? Like impressions. Yeah, poor programming
Yeah.
already upon them, that they're going to
No
struggle
malware
to
detected.
way out. Only viruses.
So how do you actually define a non-binary gender? And is it correct to actually assume that the term covers everyone or anyone who doesn't identify as a cis heterosexual person?
All right. So two really important concepts that I want to cover there. Heterosexuality is a sexual identity, whereas non-binary is a gender identity. And those two, for the most part, can be kept somewhat distant from each other. Sexuality and gender are not the same thing.
Yeah.
I think an important definition to start off with is cisgender. So cisgendered people are people who are comfortable in their gender assignment at birth. So a couple of terms that I use a lot in everyday language is AMAB, assigned male at birth, and AFAB, assigned female at birth, which are really good when trying to identify people who have certain characteristics and more prone to things like getting their periods, because there are men who get periods. You might refer to them as AFAB, although you probably shouldn't refer to them exclusively like that. It's only useful really for like medically speaking about people, if that makes sense.
So it's very clinical.
Yeah, it's clinical. And I wouldn't just talk to a friend and call them an AMAB or an AFAB.
So it sounds like a lot of this is also permission based, like needing to seek. I don't want to say like it's not people pleasing, but it's checking in and saying, you know, how would you like me to refer to you? What do you prefer? That kind of thing, and using it within context as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I actually started this podcast a bit awfully by saying, oh, what do you prefer to be called? Or what is your preferred pronouns? And that's kind of a moot point. It's not a preference. They and them are my pronouns. I don't prefer to be called they and them. It's just they and them are my pronouns. So yeah, it's a lot of checking in, and it's a lot of coming to the realization that we aren't really understanding humans fully. You know, we're complicated organisms that a binary definition does not quite suit. And non-binary as a definition, I use it for myself purely because I do not associate as a man or as a woman, and therefore I am not binary. So either of those two would be considered binary genders.
That's a very literal definition of non-binary.
Very, very literal. And within the smaller scope of non-binary, there's a lot going on. There are people who are genderqueer, agender, so people who don't have a gender. There's a whole lot more going on within the non-binary subset. So yeah, to answer your question, it is a lot about asking people for information which might not be apparent on looking at them, but is true to who they are as a person. And it just comes from a place of we're striving for a culture, or at least I'm striving for a culture, where we don't see that as a chore or a task, where it's just normal to say, hi, I am X, and this is my dealio. And for that to be okay. And for
That's
that to
amazing.
be, normalized.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing, because just considering, I'm just thinking back to when I changed the GP that I saw, and I went to a different practice, and you get the intake form. And it's
Forms.
forms. Yay, this is something we should definitely talk about. Just the information they ask for, it is incredibly gendered, and I sort of understand why they need to know what your physiology is, if that's the right word, or biology, like what you've got going on. But I find just that the options are really limited on all forms. There's no space for you to say, actually, it's this. This is me.
I have definitely come across this problem. So a lot of forms will ask you for your gender, and they will have 2 boxes, maybe 3 if you're especially lucky. And the weird thing is, I find it strange in medical practices how a few of them still have similar forms, because there should be a few more questions that go on there. What is your sex? Is, I think, maybe the only one relevant to your medical history or how people are going to treat you, your physiology, sex. So, give us the sex option. How about letting us write it in as well? That would be really nice for all of these, rather than, circle one of 2 options. And on sex, there are, I'm not too sure if you're aware, there aren't even binary sexes. So we have males and females as sexes, and they're determined by primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Primary characteristics are things like what your genitals are, and what their function is. Secondary characteristics might be things like body hair, deepness of voice, things that are a little bit...
more subtle?
Yeah, more subtle. They're intersex people as a start. People who have primary and secondary characteristics of both the sexes in any degree, you can be considered intersex. So for a start, just considering biology, there's more than 2 options. There's a lot more than 2 options. And you don't hear a lot about intersex people. They make up about 1.7% of the population as recorded. Now, if that is as recorded, there's a whole lot of room for people to slip through the gaps, because often determining whether people are intersex doesn't come up, whether or not someone has XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes, and yet demonstrates primary or secondary sexual characteristics of one or another gender, of one or another sex, sorry. You might never get tested on what your chromosomes are, for example.
What's amazing about what you've just said that's brought up a really important point, I think, is even having a form, no matter what you're signing up to or what kind of form you're filling out, even if you write outside of those boxes, the information that you need to record, it's still kind of making you identify yourself in a very formal way. And depending what kind of form you're doing that with and the agency you're doing that through, whether it's a government agency or religious or anything like that, that's not always necessarily a safe thing for someone to do.
For sure. Yeah, disclosing your gender, especially if it's not conforming with society's idea of, what a man or a woman should look like, is dangerous, is straight up dangerous. You can be met with hostility and volatile reactions. I have. So yeah, sometimes these forms are really poor for doing that, and that often it's a fear that a lot of queer people, especially gender diverse people, get when they fill in these forms. They're like, is this gonna do me harm if I fill this in truthfully or you know, can it relate to anything if I fill it in how they
Is it going to
perceive
come
I
back
should
to
fill
me
it
in some weird way that I can't foresee right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it even happens in, I guess, legal ways. Like I know as someone who, when they were born, they couldn't actually decide whether they were male or female, based on their biology. And so they got to choose, the doctors chose for that human being that the gender that they would be assigned. And later on that this person decided they were actually the opposite. They didn't want to be that gender. They actually identified as a different gender. But on their health records, on their birth certificate, on their driver's license, it all had a gender that was assigned at birth. And so this person was very limited in terms of, if they ever got pulled over by the police, if they were speeding, they would have to, argue that they were actually that person, because their driver's license said one thing and yet, that their physical appearance said something completely different. And they couldn't get a passport because the photo didn't match the information, the clinical information that was reported at birth. And this did happen quite a few years ago, and I hope to God now they have processes in place to help people to have the correct identification documentation that resonates with who they are, and not something completely opposite that actually impinges on their human rights, on their ability and their freedom that the rest of us so easily enjoy.
Yeah, from the legal perspective, it's an absolute nightmare to change your gender and then to get that certified and have that translate over to things like passports and cards. Like, it's a privilege to not have to do that. So it's kind of one of those things that you might consider like cis privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never having to worry about these things.
Yeah.
That's amazing, because I never would have. It's one of those things that I just, like you said, I don't have to think about it, so I don't.
Yeah.
And it just is a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. My daughter's school, they actually really do ask the children, when you fill out the form, they actually do ask you not specifically what their pronouns are, but what they identify as in terms of their gender. And the classrooms, when they call the roll in the morning, they actually do have, they've given the students an option, do you have a preferred name? And they've allowed the students to actually choose then a name for themselves that they prefer. So there's children in the class who will have, were born with a very stereotypical female name, but on the roll call, they've been asked to be called a name, like, this is not the name, I'm just going to say it because it's a great example, but the name like Charlie, where Charlie could be a girl, but it could be a boy, or Max, it could be short for Maxine, could be short for Maximus. Like, it's, these names that kind of aren't typically associated just being one gender, like Sarah, Kate, Jody, are very female names. And I find that really beautiful. I do really love the fact that this high school has allowed these children this space to actually explore and to claim their identity how they want to.
Yeah, that's really progressive and fantastic. Wow, that would have been really nice to have, I think, growing up, because I didn't really learn about about gender, and that my feelings of turmoil inside were a thing that I could have until well into my 20s. And teaching kids to question and wonder and change is perfectly acceptable and wonderful, and I think they should be given the space to do that. It's healthy for them. They will get so much out of it later in life.
How did you, as you were growing up, did you ever feel there were points where, like, looking back now, you're like, yeah, that was definitely a point when, like, I remember being 6 years old or something and feeling like I didn't belong in my body, or that I didn't identify with this? Like, were there moments that you can look back now in childhood and be like, oh, that's what that was? Or was it, not until puberty or later that you started to battle this identity?
Yes. So there are some like very specific points that I realized I had some amount of distance around being a boy or a man. And they came out in really strange ways that I can identify now, but at the time would have been very confusing. For a start, I never really felt like I fit in the boys' club. I was bullied as a young man, and well, as a young person. I feel like part of that was because people could tell that there was something not the same. I wasn't like the other boys, and I didn't enjoy the exact same things that the other boys did. I actually found a lot more comfort hanging around the girls and all my femme friends at the time. Having a twin sister who was also associated with those groups was somewhat prohibitive. And, you know, some of that bullying came out in homophobia and things, which, you know, I'd love to touch on later. But yeah, around puberty, when I started growing body hair and having already been exposed to things like traditional pornography at the time, I found a really big, a big challenge was having body hair, especially hair on my legs and around my groin and my snail trail and stuff. Was really challenging for me, and that's something that I haven't really spoken to many people about, and I've only sort of had the time in my late 20s to identify where that came from, and that came from sort of traditional femme imagery, especially in things like pornography, where femme people are totally clean shaven. And I didn't enjoy like seeing masculine people who were hairy, and I didn't enjoy seeing myself hairy because I wanted to be more feminine, gentle, dainty. And look, I know that this is already twisted in patriarchal like views and requirements of women, and I can acknowledge that, but it didn't help me at the time. So yeah, that was probably some of my earliest memories of having dysphoria about being a man or a boy. You know, I've often also I used to do things like drag, and my burlesque is very femme, but some of my earliest memories after I had my first partner, and during my first partnership, during one evening, it was someone's birthday, it might have been mine. We all got really drunk, we just turned 18, it was fantastic, and someone, you know, dared me to wear a dress, and I went into my partner's wardrobe, picked out a dress, tried it on, and I remember just like I remember feeling embarrassed, and most of my embarrassment was due to how comfortable I felt. And I didn't want other people to know that this actually didn't bother me. That I was suddenly like, oh wow, you know, dresses and skirts and things are actually just clothes, and you know, they're pretty and they're nice and they feel good, and
Hey, I'm comfortable. This is
why
good.
I'm comfortable. I don't know why I haven't worn this stuff before, but of course, a lot of that is associated through our patriarchal values still in society as being weak or feminine, and I thought that wasn't okay at the time. And gosh, keep in mind that I'm just 18 at that point. I had no idea what was going on. I just knew I felt okay. And then I did drag a bit later in my 20s. I just remember like the act of putting on makeup and dresses and everything was really empowering for me at the time. It made me feel and look good. And it made me feel a bit truer to myself when doing it. But with that in mind, like I'm not a woman, and I don't feel like a woman, but I'm just not a man, and I don't feel like a man. So finally having the medium of traditionally femme clothing accessible to me, and having like my second partner who is just really open and quite happy to go through any and all of this stuff with me, letting me try on her clothes and doing makeup together and stuff like that was really nice in the limited capacity that it happened at the time.
That sounds quite beautiful. You know, that the exploration and, you know, the self-discovery. I mean, I can dare to imagine the little sparks of joy that must have happened as you went through that.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was finally feeling like I didn't have to hide something. And in fact, it was a thing that I didn't even know I was hiding for so long. So yeah, those are some of my earliest memories of thinking that I wasn't, not quite knowing what was going on with me. About 3 years ago, I started dating a non-binary person, and being actively involved with queer people and other queer people. I've always considered myself bisexual, so I exist in that space, in queer space, somewhat already. But spending a lot of my time with queer people and going to parties where every single person there is queer, going to events where every single person there is queer, and where everyone just wants everybody else to like be themselves and live their best life as they can, really started making me think, hey, there's more to me than just dressing and presenting the way I am. And that's when I really had the opportunity to start living my life as a non-binary person, because I found a space where that was okay and comfortable, and that transitioned into me just feeling more and more comfortable as the last 3 years have gone by, feeling like I can be myself in more spaces. And like, it started with subtle things. So I've always had a sense of fashion, however bleak, but it's always been sort of long pants, shirts, button-up shirts, and vests, like waistcoats. And as I've explored, I've really like adding things like patterns and traditional femme associated things like flowers. You might be able to see my shirt. Like, this became more normalized to me. Wearing jewelry and earrings, and wearing more pinks and traditionally femme things, and incorporating them into what is essentially a very traditional masc outfit is my representation of who I am.
That's very cool.
So yeah.
Like, I love that beautiful blend you've got going on there.
Thank you.
It
Pretty
really
spiffy.
is. One of the things that I love about Nic is like, you have this incredible way of expressing yourself, which I've always admired, and it's really quite interesting. Where I find, being a cis female, I find that you have found this incredible way of having this self-expression and claiming this self-expression that I think, as a female who identifies as being a cis female, hasn't always been entitled to, because there are those expectations, like you said, about, having your legs shaved, and it's like, oh shit, well, I am a female, I better have my legs shaved, and we fall into these traps all the time. And I love the fact, you sharing this beautiful experience you had of being in this relationship that was where your partner creates a very safe space for you to be able to find your identity and explore your identity and be creative with your identity. And I think, oh my God, isn't that what we all crave as human beings? Have a safe space just to be ourselves, to explore ourselves, and to find out who we are. So I think it's such a beautiful and necessary conversation to have, because I think there's so much that every single person could learn from this conversation for themselves, even regardless if we go beyond gender, just as human beings. That there's so much of what you're saying, Nic, that I think, oh, it just pulls at my heart, and it's just like, I feel like all humans yearn for this acceptance. There's this feeling of belonging in their own skin, and we don't have it. And it's such a powerful, what's the word I'm looking for? Like revolution, I suppose, when we talk about non-binary gender. That's actually teaching the rest of the world to show up more and to stop judging and to be more accepting and to look beyond what we see and to really understand people at their core being, which is so powerful.
Yeah, and that all starts by questioning just about everything that you're doing,
Like everything.
and whether or not you're doing it for yourself. Like everything. So why do I wear these particular colors is a good start. You know, you both have clothes on. Why have you chosen these particular outfits? What's led to those choices? I never used to buy things in pink or pastels because they weren't masculine colors. And when I started challenging myself on that, I was like, I actually really enjoy pinks and florals and pastels. They really suit me. I love the way they look. I think they're pretty, and hey, I can be pretty too. And just because I have a moustache and a somewhat deep voice, I'm allowed to be pretty. And encouraging every other person that you can to do what makes them happy, not what they think they need to do to conform to gender, is quite an important step of unwinding how we've like deeply rooted ourselves in these two camps of male and female, and can start just like being happy. You know, if you don't want to put makeup on, don't put makeup on. If you want to wear earrings, wear earrings. Doesn't matter who you are. Do that stuff for you. And I know it's a lot easier to just say because there are still things like work expectations, but it starts in the small elements you can, finding your community if you can, or finding a small group of friends, or finding your family if they'll have you. And that's a big thing. Some families don't get it, and a lot of people can't just turn to their family for it, for this room. So the queer community tries to hold itself together as much as it can and support all the young and baby queers who are coming through and might not have support groups yet. But yeah.
Building on that, I'm curious to ask about your experiences going through all of this self-discovery and exploration, and what did that translate to when it came to talking about it with your family? You know, were they accepting? Were there screaming matches? How did this unfold for you?
So a bit of context to that is, firstly, I have a fantastic older sister who I instantly knew that I could just tell anything to, and we actually have a pretty good set of communicative skills. And just in case nobody clued in, it is Verity. I'm talking about Verity here.
I was going to say, who's that?
So yeah, coming out to Verity was really my first step in coming out to my family, and everybody else took a lot more time. During such a time, my biological father, John, passed away in August 2 years ago, just as I was recognizing that this is the person that I am. And one of my deepest regrets is that I never got to speak to John about it and have him acknowledge and recognize me as the person I am. After he passed away, and after I had some time to grieve over that, I decided that I needed my family to know, because I didn't anything could happen at any day, and I wanted them to value me for the human I am, and not just what they thought they were. So I came out to my biological mother, Veronica, and she does okay. She doesn't quite understand it in the sense that I think most cisgendered people are going to struggle to understand my experiences, and she does her best on things like pronouns, and she's gotten so much better, but she had some genuine opinions going into it, and I really had to have some talks to her about how damaging those opinions were. So mum was okay. I didn't tell, I have a twin sister. I didn't tell my twin sister, but at our mother's last birthday, she informed me that she knew, and it's probably because I actually put it in my Instagram posts and stuff that I'm non-binary. So she's a real tech head, and I'm positive she picked up on that. But I met serious. We had a bit of a conflict on that evening, and this is something about pronouns and correcting people that I would like to get into.
Go for gold.
I corrected her on my pronouns as she was having a conversation. And once I've told someone, I will correct them on my pronouns. But up until that point, I'm actually not fussed. I don't get a huge amount of dysphoria. It's not so much that I can't bear with it when people refer to me by the wrong pronouns. But once I've told someone, it's actually pretty important to me that they at least try. And she did the perfect thing, which was she said, "Oh, my brother Nick," and then went on, and I went, "Your sibling Nick," and she kept going for about a 5-minute conversation. And then after a 5-minute conversation, I thought that was perfect. I was just like so happy. She just changed her word. Didn't really need an acknowledgement. She just changed the language really quickly. And I'm like, perfect, great. That's how I like it. And then afterwards, she turned to me and she's like, "You don't need to correct me." And I'm like, pardon me, but I do need to correct you because you got it wrong. And it turned into this shouting match in the middle of a restaurant between me and my twin sister at the time. I don't know where it stemmed from or why she couldn't be corrected on this. I expect that it goes back to our history as brother and sister, as siblings. Yeah, I even do it myself all the time. But our history as siblings. But that was challenging, and it has prevented me from wanting to continue that conversation with her. It was unnecessary. I have no idea why it turned into a shouting match. She did the perfect thing, which was changing her language and then carrying on the conversation. And every time I do correct someone, the perfect response, the optimal response is, "Sorry, change language, keep going with conversation." And it shouldn't be any more than that. A lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm really bad at this. I hope you can forgive me." And I don't actually need someone to do that. In fact, it's putting a lot of the onus on me to now acknowledge your feelings about getting my pronouns wrong. And I'm like, I don't know why that's now my responsibility. You can correct yourself. You just should correct yourself. Keep going with the conversation. If I, correct you and you don't acknowledge it, then I've got a problem. If I correct you and you do and you keep going, then I'm just like, yeah, perfect. That's the interactions that I want. But when someone comes to me with "Oh, I'm so sorry," or "Oh, this is too hard," or "Please forgive me," I'm suddenly like, now I've got to bear the emotional responsibility of making you feel better over you you forgetting a thing about me. Honestly, it's not my responsibility.
Yeah, and I suppose it's almost, I don't want to say that it's the same, but we would expect that if we termed someone's title incorrectly as if we called them Miss instead of Doctor, like you would just correct that so easily in a normal sentence. Why would this be any
For sure,
different?
doctors worked hard. Yeah. Doctors worked hard as hell for their title, their honorific. And when you correct yourself from Miss to Doctor, you don't sit there and go, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It was so hard. I'll get there eventually." You just kind of do it.
There's no
Whereas,
guilt. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't need you to feel guilty about getting my pronouns wrong, just as long as you're happy for me to correct you when you do, and then for you to acknowledge that in either saying a sorry or changing your language and moving on. I don't care if it happens 10 times in a row. At some point, I'm going to probably think, you're not trying quite hard enough to lock that into your brain, but like, just acknowledging that you said the wrong thing and keeping going is just the best way to approach.
I love that so much. Like, it's full disclosure. I am the person that will screw up the pronouns royally and stumble over my words and just have a bit of a freak out that I've offended somebody. So hearing that, I know it wasn't, I'm getting all tangled up in my head with this now, but it's kind of reassuring to hear that for someone like me who stresses about doing that and have I offended somebody, and you know, it's just nice to
I think it takes
have that
awkwardness
clarified.
out of it.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, you don't have to go into a puddle of guilt, and then the other person who, you know, is just having a boundary, as their, you know, natural rights aren't then put in the position of playing counselor to fix your emotions when you got something wrong in the first place. Like it just gives a breathing space of being able to have, and this is what I love about conversing with you, Nic, is, you know, you correct me and I don't have to go into, oh my God, I've just said the wrong thing. And then I don't have to go into masses of guilt. And it doesn't put you into a situation of having to make me feel better. And then suddenly the conversation's all about me instead of whatever we were talking about. And I love it. It gives me freedom. It's like, it's okay to make mistakes, just correct yourself, move on. It's like, oh yeah, that actually feels really good.
Yeah, you're only human, and I acknowledge that humans make mistakes. If you dig your feet in and insist you haven't made a mistake, or need someone to say it's okay, like I think at some point you've got to work on yourself there. You know, have a bit more love for yourself if you feel like other people have to be there for you and say, oh, it's okay to make mistakes. Like, you're just human. You're totally fine.
So
we can keep going.
And I think as well, having that space actually really makes it easier for other people to become part and participate in the conversation, knowing that they're not going to get judged or ostracized or you know, grilled or whatever if they get it wrong. I think so many of us refuse to partake in a conversation because we're so worried about upsetting someone else or getting it wrong, and therefore then they don't participate in that conversation at all and nothing changes. So having that really beautiful safe space, I think it's absolute gold. I think it's like you have in that safe space to explore your identity, and then expanding that safe space so other people can come in and understand and be educated around identity. Like, it's a win-win. It's so beautiful.
Definitely. Like, I'm always up for having chats about gender identity. And I will always hold a space and acknowledge that some people, you know, haven't done as much reading as me, and some people have done a lot more reading than me. But, you know, that it's okay to make mistakes and not know terminology. There are so many words surrounding this that it might feel inaccessible if people are going to be obtuse or rude about how you approach these conversations. So, but look, honestly, all my friends and all the queer people that I know are just so happy to hold that space and be like, yes, let's go have a conversation about gender, chat to me about it. I think a lot of people who ask also have some feelings. They're like, maybe I don't know what's quite right for me. maybe I'm feeling some of what you are, and if I can clarify any of that for anyone, and if they're just like, oh no, okay, I see what it's about, and no, that's not what I'm feeling at all. It's something else. It's just a bit of reflux or something. Then at least like I've had that conversation, and they might have a few more words in their head that they're like, oh yeah, I now know how to approach people, and I feel a little more confident in this area. I'm always happy to have that and hold that space. I would just like people to come into that as open-minded as they can, and acknowledge that they don't hold all the answers already. And as I said before, I was talking about intersex people and how sex and gender are different things. About 1.7% of the population can be is like registered as intersex, and that's discluding all the people who slip through the gaps because they just don't show enough primary or secondary sexual traits for it to ever be relevant for them. But that's about the same number of people as redheads in the world.
Wow.
And when we consider hair color, we say, there's brunettes, raven, blonde, redheads. Am I missing anything? I don't think so.
Black.
They cover the main categories. Yeah, black. And we don't disclude redheads because they make up only 2% of the hair population of that color.
Yeah.
They're just as included. So when talking about anything, acknowledge that you probably just don't know as much as there is out there in the world. And just in terms of sexual traits, like it's so complicated, and there's so many different variants. Biology isn't perfect, and if you can accept that, then my gender identity can't, is more complicated than you just thinking that there are men and women and nothing in between. Because our brains are like super complicated, tiny little computers of meat. That
Such a
hardly
gross
know
image
what
in
they
my
want.
head.
It is in your head. That hardly even know what they want. And so like saying there are only two genders
Yeah.
is just like, it's a refusal of acknowledging like how little in the universe you actually know.
Yeah, it's incredibly confining.
It is confining, and it's really good talking to young people and for them to. I had this fantastic conversation with Verity's daughters, and I brought my partner around, who's also non-binary, and we had a conversation. And at some point during the evening, Verity's daughters asked my partner, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And my partner was just like, I'm neither. And we got to sat down and have a chat, and they picked it up super well. And the look on their faces when they realized that they didn't have to be confined by being, a girl, or by dressing this way, or acting in this way, it was like really remarkable. And I hope
Like,
that they
we
remember
have
those
options.
conversations. Yeah, there are options. There's so much out there. And even if you feel just like a tingle of, something's not right, you're totally valid in feeling that.
Yeah.
And there's no recipe for a non-binary person. There's nothing that I also have to adhere to. If I didn't wear florals and pinks and stuff, if I dressed masculinely every day and had masculine haircuts and heaps of, if I just pretty much presented entirely as a man and still told you I'm non-binary, I'm still non-binary. I don't have to meet any criteria or definition. I don't have to try being androgynous. I don't have to try and change the status quo to still be non-binary. And if it's just a slight inkling in your head that you're like, yeah, there's just something about people calling me, sir, or calling me man and stuff that really gets me. And that's what it started out. It was just small things that was starting to get to me. And I'm like, this doesn't feel right. This isn't right for me. This isn't me. I'm not man. I'm not sir. I'm not things like that. And I don't have better alternatives for you, by the way. You know, I'm not saying, oh, here's my honorifics that you should be using. I'm just like, it started off with me just being like, that doesn't feel right.
Yeah, I love it. And I think, you know, I love the fact that my daughters can come to you and they'll come to me and they'll also be like, Mum, you know, can you ask Nic about this? Or can, you know, you ask Riley about this? And I'm always like, well, you have to go ask them. Like, I always put everything back on to you, Nic, because I think it's so beautiful for, you know, the people who are living it to actually explain their experience that they're living. And yeah, my girls just like, they eat it up. It's so normal for them to have these conversations, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. And then I really love the fact that, you know, I'm dating a man who is very, very cis male beyond belief. And he grew up in the country. He, you know, beer guzzling, rugby player. You know, he's the one like at the front of the pack, you know, the really big guy. You know, he's like taking on the world, protecting
Just
his
think
team,
Wreck-It Ralph, everybody.
He's Wreck-It Ralph. He, you know,
Oh my gosh, he is Wreck-It Ralph.
he is Wreck-It Ralph. Everyone does this. It's so funny. Everyone realizes, oh my God, it's Wreck-It Ralph. And he loves wrecking things and he loves building things. Very, very in that very stereotypical. He's very hairy. Everything about him is very, very stereotypically masculine, that, you know, the patriarchy's fed him. And I remember when I had this conversation, I'm like, I really want you to meet my sibling Nic, and I thought, oh my God, I have no idea how this is going to go. And at first, you know, Jason really struggled. He really couldn't understand, like, why does, you know, Nic choose this? And we had all these like, and I was just like, just speak to Nic about it, ask Nic the questions. And, you know, you guys have had conversations, and then when he's come to your burlesque performances, and he was like cheering and like whooping and clapping, and he just thought it was brilliant. And, you know, he's had more questions that he's been able to ask your friends at the burlesque shows who also identify as non-gender binary. And it's so beautiful now that he's so open and so kind of like he's allowed himself to be educated and expanded and opened up further, and to be more accepting of things that, you know, traditional roles didn't offer him to begin with. And I just think it's absolutely remarkable how much we can challenge other people's traditional ideas and preconceived ideas of what is masculine and what is feminine. And Jason now looks at Nic, and Jason's like, Nic's just the coolest cat. Like, he just, you know, Jason just thinks like that Nic has this incredible way of expressing his identity. And, you know,
Their
when
identity.
Nic turns up for dinner, your identity, sorry. And when Nic turns up for dinner in, you know, this incredible suit, and then with these incredible earrings and like gorgeous makeup on, and Jason is just in awe. Jason is just like Nic's so fucking cool. And I'm like, yeah, Nic's cool. But it's this really, I think there's so many ways that we can accept each other and learn about each other, and it helps us to expand. And we've been now in situations where, you know, Jason's been out with his workmates who are also very cis male, and they've made comments about the queer community, and Jason's jumped straight in and completely and utterly defending and educating them in a really beautiful way. And that just makes my heart swell. I love this ability, and this is what this platform's about, having these conversations, understanding concepts that we didn't grow up with, and they may be uncomfortable to have at first, but the more that we have them, the more that we can educate ourselves, the more that we can expand our own awareness, the more we become conscious of other people and other people's experiences that are so different from ours. I just think we create a more beautiful world where everyone has a space to discover themselves. Everyone has a space to explore their identity, and everyone has a space to feel loved and respected and belonged. And I just think that's so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, your partner is a very wonderful human, and like fills my heart with joy when I get to see him, and gives me a very real and genuine sense that he is comfortable with me and comfortable around me. So I do quite enjoy spending time with your partner. And one thing I want to touch on is masculinity is great and good. It is one end of a spectrum of, between femininity and masculinity. And there's nothing wrong with being all on that end. I think the important conversation is to have that, like, patriarchy being the real problem teaches us that there's only two options and that one of those options is better. But if you're going to go for the other option, like, you have to go hard on the other option, and that's it. And
you have to go to the extreme ends. Yeah,
deconstructing that in ourselves just comes with learning that it's okay to blend these things if you want. You don't have to want to do that. I'm sure Jason has no inclination of dressing and wearing what I do, is super happy and content with where he is now, and that's perfect. That suits him and who he is.
You have inspired him, though, to wear nipple tassels.
Oh yeah, we still got to do that, don't we?
What?
Yeah. Okay, so
He's like, what's going on?
in my burlesque, we have nipple tassels, and we need to make them spin and twirl. And Jason just thinks that he will be better than me at it, and I'm confident that
I will fly to Perth and buy front row seats to this show.
We can film it. That's not a problem. We can definitely film this.
I will throw champagne on both of you.
You can, like, text Verity a message. The champagne now. We'll live stream it or something. It'll be great.
We'll live stream it. We'll sell tickets.
Nic, I really wanted to ask you, from sort of, I suppose, a legal perspective, probably on a bit more of a serious note, if there are changes that you want to see legislated in Australia, I mean, this is just in the Australian context, but if there are things that you'd love to see enacted across Australia that maybe make life easier,
for gender non-conforming individuals, yeah, heaps. There's a lot of medical.
Got a laundry list.
There is a lot of medical gatekeeping towards things like gender affirmation drugs and surgery. That is somewhat unnecessary. It's really hard, and it doesn't affect me as such, but it does affect a lot of people who are seeking to have some sort of transition, either medically or surgically, and they have to like fight tooth and nail to have that done. They have to go to X number of psych appointments, which is money, and if you are from a lower socioeconomic background, you don't have that money. You need to find the right doctors who are willing to say, yes, I'm willing to prescribe things like estrogen or testosterone. And it's really hard. It's all too hard for someone who's just like, if I could just, try this for a bit, it might make my life a lot better. There's a few doctors who are really good in Perth, a few GPs that you can go to, and they're quite happy to get you started on stuff. But unless you know who they are, you're going to really struggle in the system, because things like
patriarchy strikes again.
Yeah, pretty much. Medical gatekeeping, you don't know what you really want type deal. It's about like trusting the individual to know what best suits them, and I don't feel like if I did experience more dysphoria, I was considering for a little while of starting estrogen, but not starting hormone blockers that would block my production of testosterone, because I'm like, stuff like facial hair doesn't bother me, and stuff like my muscle mass doesn't bother me. But there are some things that I think I would like. Maybe some days, this is a thing, like part of me being non-binary is, some days I'm like, I would absolutely 100% love to present entirely femme. I would love hips and boobs and to wear femme clothing, and for people to be like, yeah, that's a woman, and some days I'm very happy being perceived as a man, and some days I want neither of those things. I want like precisely in the middle. So yeah, I considered for a little while just starting estrogen without starting hormone blockers, and one of the biggest concerns for me was just like how much money that would cost to get started seeing a GP and then a psych and getting referral to the correct people.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's not
cost
cheap.
prohibitive, and there is a very poor structure in Australia right now for us providing that to people. It's not properly recognised as a it's not treated with the severity it's due, because like I genuinely think like gender affirmation is really important to people's mental health.
Oh my gosh, hugely. And I mean, that leads
Yeah.
into a much larger conversation that we might get into on another episode about the state of mental health in Australia, because it's kind of appalling.
Yeah, look, the state of
Yeah.
queer mental health as well is such an issue to go on about there. Like all these tiny little microaggressions that make it hard to just be yourself really impacts things like everyday life. You know, people, when I go out dressed like I am and I see people that I know from work and stuff, I get comments all the time, and they're microaggressions that are like, "Ooh, there's something weird about you," and it's something as simple as a cis white guy going, "Oh, yeah, digging the pirate look with your earrings," but he's got a bit of a sneer on his face, and I know he's trying to point out to me that I look weird. I'm like, thanks, bud. Yeah, no, I got these holes myself, and I'm wearing them. I'm doing this, but yeah, all that stuff is really draining. So
I imagine,
like
yeah.
one way I would, that's one way I would change. I would like legislation to better suit gender non-conforming individuals.
I suppose that also is like, we can change the legislation, and that would, I suppose, systematically allow for greater ease of access to things, you know, in a very mechanical kind of way. But we also have to do the social and cultural work that backs that up, because otherwise the legislation doesn't really mean anything if you still have doctors who have really terrible backwards attitudes.
Yeah, correct. And that's why I have these conversations. Every time I have one of these conversations with someone, you know, it's somebody else who goes out there a little more informed, maybe a little more empathetic to how I live my life and how other gender non-conforming individuals live their life. You know, especially trans folk are greatly hindered in this. You know, still a lot of like taboo and misunderstanding about trans folk, and still a lot of doctors who don't understand and don't know what's best for these individuals. Another one that's I'm not too sure how relevant in Australia it is, but this is just a generally good one, is essentially like free the nipple. So in the States, if you are a trans woman and exposing your breasts in a public place, like on a beach, you'll get fined, because that is weirdly not allowed. But then you'll be sent to an all-male prison, and it's this weird double standard that's held for trans individuals.
I've heard
and
similar
gender
stories.
non-conforming individuals. So yeah, like let's just free the nipple and clear that one up. That would be a good one.
Let's just start with the nipple. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard similar stories. It's going to get a bit bleak now, but I've heard that this also translates to things like homicide rates, because police don't know how to identify the body that they encounter, and that makes the identification process extremely like more difficult. because they don't know what to do. If the driver's license and ID that maybe they find near the body doesn't match what they see, you know, it can be extremely hard to track down the right people to contact. And, you know, I've heard some pretty shocking stories around how long it takes family to be notified or next of kin, and all these issues are just, oh my goodness, it gets grim quick.
Yeah, some of that definitely can just be solved by training exercises and teaching people correct language and what's what and how to identify things. And I don't think any of this is remotely high on the police sort of to learn list presently. But you know, that's a whole basket of fish that's would be hard to unpack.
I've got to ask a question. I know I keep peppering you with questions, and thank you so much for your patience with me.
Why I'm here.
I'm really curious when I sort of zoom out a bit and try to look at what's happening socially and culturally with Australia, and I kind of look at it, and what I see is white men of they're very much identifying as men, in one group controlling most of the things that affect everybody else, but below that is the white woman who's kind of in second place. But what I kind of see is almost like a hierarchy within equality. Like, it seems to me that there's some kind of, I'm just curious about your perspective on this. I kind of see a thing where it's like, okay, we can't help our non-binary friends until we sort out the issue for women. Like, it's almost like I almost see like this weird priority thing happening. And I'm curious if you see that as well or not.
For sure, and that's where my whole my concepts of feminism come from, and where I'm coming from. Intersectional feminism is especially important in recognizing that there are lots of facets that all people deal with that are like systematically and culturally tied in with society that are a result of a failing on feminism, like pretty much patriarchal rule, by first and I guess foremost, what I see is that femme is not okay. Being effeminate, being a woman, wearing pink is generally considered not okay, and all of the tiny little things tied in with that. And if we can attack that as a root cause, that femme is equal to masc, then hopefully the rest becomes easier and easier to dismantle. And that's, you know, my notion of feminism comes from attacking the root cause, because feminism plays a big part in my life. I present somewhat femme. All my burlesque is femme. I feel like when people see that, the bit that they despise is the femme part. If they do despise it at all, a lot of people like it. But like above, I wouldn't say above equality, but like the real disparity between men and women presently is not that men are considered better, but it's that femme is considered worse, and everything to do with it. And it's what makes it hard for queer people to interact in a patriarchal world, makes it hard for gay men to interact with the patriarchal world, or butch women to interact, because they're always seen as lesser because of one reason or another. You can attribute their actions to being femme.
Wow.
Don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's
I just
amazing.
feel like we can attack one bigger issue than being like, oh, let's make everything okay for women, and then non-binary people, and then disabled people. You know, it's a much broader issue than it's unequal.
there's some schools of thought that say, I think that, you know, exactly what you just said, you can't tackle disabled issues until you tackle the violence issue, until you tackle, it's almost like there's some schools of thought that, you know, and I come across this on social media sometimes, that is like, well, you can't really do anything until you fix a white woman's problem. And then it's like a weird trickle down pyramid-y kind of looking thing.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if I'm understanding correctly, but that does sound a lot like white feminism, which specifically caters towards white women and making their lives better, but it's not like tackling any other issue. And my feminism, and what I describe as intersectional feminism, and says that all of these things are actually interlinked. They're not just singular issues. They'll all come apart together as we unravel the negative effects of patriarchy. So yeah, I don't think it's a hit one and then the next one will be easier. I think it's like everything will be extracted at the same time, really. We just need to make everybody else see the same thing that we are, I guess, at the same time.
Wow.
But yeah, everything is very interlinked, and my life won't get any better until every other minority's life gets better, until people of color are treated better, until disabled people are treated better. There will always be the patriarchy that is holding these people under thumb until we can
smash it,
crush that. Yeah, smash it.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to, there's this really beautiful quote. It's actually in a book, The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity and Love. And it says this, it says, the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves, even in which we understand as the feminine part. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault self-esteem. And I think that's, you know, such an important point to make, that, you know, when we talk about feminism, it's not against men, it's against a system that doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve cisgender women, it doesn't serve cisgender men, it doesn't serve transsexuals, it doesn't serve anyone who
transgendered individuals
as non-binary gender, it doesn't serve I'm getting tripped on my words. It doesn't serve, you know, people who suffer with disabilities. It doesn't serve people who you know, experience racism. It doesn't serve anybody. And once we start breaking that down, once we start allowing all individuals to feel that sense of feminine, and even for men to be able to, you know, be comfortable with emotions. And this is something I'm finding a lot lately in conversations with my partner, with the ex-husband, with my children, is this, you know, we don't allow people to be okay with their feminine side, to be okay with their emotions, because those emotions can be wild and crazy and chaotic, and we have to squash them and have all this shame and guilt around them. And, you know, I'm hearing so many men that will say to me, I'm not comfortable with emotions. I was never allowed to have them. It's not something I was ever allowed to express. And that makes me feel really sad. So I just think it's an important, you know, point that when we do talk about patriarchy, doesn't just squash everyone but men. It squashes men, well, you know, cis males as well. It doesn't serve anyone.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
It definitely shuts
like
down.
I'm not even sure why we're still going
you know,
on with this process.
Cis men. Yeah, I know, right? It's like, can everyone just agree to get rid of the patriarchy?
I beg to differ with both of you. If you are a certain person with a toupee in a certain house that is extremely white,
Trump,
and you have skin that is like a cheesel, it probably works really well for you.
It probably works for him really well now in his life.
He's a happy individual.
I think, yeah, I think at some point, if he was allowed to feel feelings and, you know, wasn't pushed into this hyper, money is everything perspective, and that men are powerful perspective, like he'd probably be a very different person.
They're much happier, but
I mean, I'd like to think my mind was flexible enough to imagine that, but it's not.
at the minute,
Yeah, look, person
just wait.
in question is pretty detestable, and hard to have like any amount of sympathy for.
So, to kind of wrap this up, Nic, which I've absolutely loved, and I reckon we're going to have so many more conversations. If there are people listening who are maybe in the really early stages of questioning, they're not sure, they're just sort of maybe stumbling their way through trying to figure out life, what words of wisdom would you like to impart to them, if any?
You're perfect. Just the person inside you is perfect, and you don't need to worry about what everybody else is thinking. You'll find some people in your life who you will be comfortable enough around to be yourself, and whatever aspects of that you are is not flawed in any way, shape, or form. I want you personally to find those people in your life, because they're going to be important. They're going to help you survive this. Because until you know who you are, I remember it's just somewhat painful every day, and depending on your level of dysphoria, it's like absolutely heartbreaking every day. But you'll find them, and life gets much better than this. You can be absolutely anything you want to be. You do not have to hold to any expectation whatsoever. You do not have to be androgynous. You do not have to be masculine. You do not have to be feminine. You will get to just be you.
That's amazing.
It's so beautiful. I'm getting teary just listening.
Me too.
And I think that's what we love about these podcasts and these interviews. It's so beautiful to be able to actually talk to human beings who are willing to be vulnerable enough and to really share their experiences with us. Because I think that's how, when people listen to this, that's where they feel that they have permission to be themselves, and feel that, if someone else is giving themselves permission to be free, then they also are entitled to that permission to free themselves as well. So I absolutely love that beautiful advice, Nic. It's so powerful, and I know that there's people out there that need to hear those words. So thank you so much for spending this time with us, for honouring us with your presence and wisdom and your insights. It's so valuable. I can't state that enough for our gratitude to have you with us.
Thank you very much for allowing me the time and definitely the space. I know I consumed the majority of it today, but it's really appreciated to get to talk about this stuff and be asked. And I have been in no way, shape or form perfect in my responses today. Every person's individual experience is going to be different. I can also acknowledge that my use of language today might also not be perfect. And if anyone gives you any feedback on that, definitely please hit me up with that, as I'll totally take that on board. And I encourage everyone to take that on board. When someone tells you that you're not doing something right, really, really consider that you're not first. And I go into almost everything just thinking, I'm not correct on this, somebody knows better than me. And take their advice on board. So thank you very much for your time, both of you.
Thank you.
Hey, if you want to continue this conversation, head over to our Facebook page and be part of the revolution. You can find us at Good Girls Don't Podcast on Facebook. Please note, we cannot create change alone. Your support, likes, comments, shares, and iTunes reviews help us to give a voice to the insanely inspirational women and the controversial issues that we discuss.
If you'd like to be a part of our podcast, or if you have an issue that you have a burning desire for us to bring into the light, please contact us. With fierceness, Ashley
and Verity.
Get ready for the revolution.